Okay, we're going to make up a stock rail, actually both stock rails for this turnout. What I need to do is to cut a length of rail that's going to be as long or longer than the final turnout length. And you can make this as long as you want. You could use a 3-foot piece of rail and build the turnout in the middle. Might be a little bit unruly, but that's definitely possible. For this example, though, I'm just going to cut a piece of rail that's maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches longer than the finished turnout size, and I can use a quick sticks to determine what that finished turnout size actually is. So I'm just going to snip off a piece about this long. I'll just do one for now, and I'm going to start by making the curved or the diverging route stock rail. Stock rail being the outside rail of the turnout. Alright, so I'm just going to put the rail into the fixture, and I'm just going to double check, make sure I got this. Actually, I'd like this to be a little bit farther out on this end, so I'll just push it forward a bit. That's good. Set that aside. So what I want to do is I'm going to mark the rail I want to remove from the stock rail. There's a little bit more detail on our stockade tool video showing why we're doing this and how to do it with the stockade tool. You may want to watch that. But for here, what I'm going to do is I'll just mark the location I want to remove some of the base of the rail from. Here and here. I'm going to pop that out of the fixture, and I'm going to remove the base of the rail between those two marks. Right in there. Alright, I use the stockade tool, which is this tool here. It's a tool we sell specifically for doing that job. And it does a pretty good job on that. And I use that tool to remove a portion of the base of the rail. This can also be done using a benchtop belt sander, or clamp it in a vise and file it off by hand. The stockade tool does make that job a lot easier, so we highly recommend that. Ready to place this rail into the fixture. What I like to do first is put a bit of a bend in this rail to match the diverging route stock, the groove of the diverging route stock rail. This rail actually has a bit of a kink in it right here, where it changes directions. It's a very slight kink, it's only a couple degrees, and then it goes into a radius and then straight through here. So I like to put a bit of a bend in there, and I bend that right at where we filed the notch here with our stockade tool. So, and it's just a slight bending. See, it's just a bit of a kink there. And then about 1 inch or so out in HO scale anyways, this starts to curve. So I just curve it by hand. You don't need to use a rail roller or a rail bender or anything for that. It's actually easier to do it by hand. So you just kind of push it along with your thumb. And I like to confirm it that I got it fairly close. It doesn't have to be a perfect match, although this one looks pretty good. All that's important is that there is a bit of a radius in here and there's a bit of a bend in there. And then we just place it in the fixture like that. And we're ready to solder that in place. Okay, I've kind of spun that around so we can get a closer look at how this groove, or how the rail's actually sitting in that groove nice, and it's nice and tight up against the outside edge there, and that's critical because in this area of the fixture there's only one side to the groove, so this can actually push in a little bit, and it's quite important that it's tight against that outside groove. And what we got here is pretty good. Alright, with that rail in place, we're ready to start soldering. What I like to do is I like to start with one solder joint around the middle of the turnout. In this case, it happens to be where the S tie is located. And I like to get one nice complete solder joint on there. And then I'll move on and solder the rest of the joints. And I like to do that just so everything's held in place while I work. So I'm just going to apply a little bit of flux on there. And solder in place. Now I highly recommend you watch the soldering video. We go through soldering in great detail. So I'm not going to repeat any of that here, but before you solder, give that one a watch, and it'll show you lots of little tips on how to do it. Okay, so I'm just going to get this one going here. Notice when I solder, it's kind of hard to see on camera, but I'm actually holding the rail in place with one finger. And that just keeps it flat in the fixture so it doesn't move around. And then I'm going to hold it in place till that solder joint freezes, which it's done there. And now with that one done, I can go back now and put some flux and solder up the rest of them. And I don't have to worry about holding it quite so diligently while I'm soldering, because this solder joint is going to do that job for me. So let's just start back here, and we'll do a few. Let's do these two to start with. Get those soldered. On this turnout, I'm actually using the acid-based flux, something else I cover in detail on the soldering video. I prefer it because I find that it helps the solder flow a lot more like water. It'll actually wick underneath the tie and get on the other side and form a really nice solder joint. As long as it's cleaned up very, very diligently after, there's no issues with using it. Now I'm going to, in this area here where the guardrail pocket is, I don't want any solder on this side of the rail, because if I put solder in here or here, it's going to interfere with the guardrail when we place it a little later on in the build. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little flux on the outside of the rail in these locations, and only solder on the outside, being careful not to get any solder inside. So a little bit of flux, and I'll solder those up. There we go. 3 nice solder joints. That's nice and solid. Now I'm going to do these two down here. And this is the very same situation. I don't want to get any solder in here. If I was to put a blob of solder in this location, when I go to switch the turnout to this direction, it's going to interfere with the switch point. So I'm only putting solder on the outside of that rail. Like that. Let it freeze. And then finally the last one is this rail, or this tie here. No solder at all on the throw bar tie. We don't want to solder that to the stock rail. If we did, the turnout wouldn't work. So we'll just leave that to the end. That's when we'll solder that to the switch points. And a little bit on both sides. Let that freeze. There we go. So that stock rail, the diverging route stock rail, is now soldered in place. We're going to repeat the exact same steps for the straight stock rail, except for it's not necessary to do any bending. We're just going to put it in place, remove the base of the rail, and then solder it in location. Alright, I've soldered in the straight route stock rail. Same process, and that step is pretty much complete.